I will not give vent to my blazing anger. I will not let the flames consume you. This prophecy from the prophet Hosea is especially apt today on the feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, a devotion based around not just an image that is well known to us, but around a reality that the image signifies. And this image always shows Jesus with his heart on fire. The Sacred Heart of Jesus is indeed the flaming furnace of charity, because God is charity, as St. John tells us. This devotion to the Sacred Heart in its modern form, contemporary form, is a relatively new devotion in the life of the Church, and we Catholics are privileged to be able to say relatively new, meaning it started about 400 years ago. The Sacred Heart of Jesus was given in a vision to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, very famously. You know the story, that Jesus appeared to her under this form and urged her to have this devotion spread in the Church. It wasn't, in fact, until Pius IX in the mid-1800s that the feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus was extended to the universal Church, so that all of the missals that we place on our altars now, all of them throughout the world, have the feast of the Sacred Heart. And it wasn't until Pius XI that great public cultus was given to this feast of the Sacred Heart. But the devotion to the Sacred Heart has its roots much earlier. In the High Middle Ages, the 1300s, the 1200s, the women mystics especially, like St. Gertrude, were already proposing this devotion to the Sacred Heart, this meditation upon the reality of the physical heart of Jesus. And her contemporaries and even forebears like St. Bonaventure and St. Bernard were singing of the treasury that was opened for us when the soldier opened Christ's side with his lance. St. Bernard so poetically says, "He opened the treasury, and I have gone in and have made the treasure my own." And even before these great teachers, we had the fathers of the Church speaking about this incarnational reality. The Sacred Heart of Jesus is such an apt image because the love of God, which has been from all the ages eternal in heaven, is incarnate among us at the end of the ages. The last age is this age of the incarnation, where God himself has become a man and has dwelt among us, with all that that entails, except original sin and personal sin. He has a heart. And there's a reason that the poets in every age and in every society have spoken of the heart being the seat of man's life. Indeed, perhaps the senses go to the brain, and indeed, perhaps the thinking function is in this mind that uses perhaps the brain as its organ. But there's a reason that we speak about the distance between the head and the heart, and always the direction that we ought to be moving is from the head to the heart. The heart is our goal. The heart is indeed the summary of human existence. It encapsulates all of what it means to be a man, to be a human being. And Jesus has a heart. Jesus experienced our life with us. And this was not just to gain something that he didn't have. He's the creator of all things. He was the one who created physical existence. But indeed, it was in order to share with us, not just in intention, but even in physical reality, what it is that we experience. Jesus proposed this existence, this shared incarnate reality with his human creation in order to show us the depths of his love. And so it's appropriate that the symbol of that love that has come to us, especially in this modern age of the Church, is the Sacred Heart. And look at him. He proposes his heart. He holds it out to us. He offers it to us for us to take and make our own. And this is indeed the incarnational reality of God's mode of salvation. He could have saved us any way he wished, but he chose to do so by joining us in our physical circumstance so that we at the end of our lives, can also join him in his heavenly circumstance. But come back to the prophet Hosea. He says, speaking for God, with the words that God himself sent him to speak, he says, "My heart is overwhelmed, my pity is stirred, and therefore I will not give vent to my blazing anger. I have pity, and so I will not pour out my anger upon you. I will not let the flames consume you." In God, there is only one reality. There is only charity. He is what he is. He is unchanging from age to age. He is utter simplicity. And that simplicity is, in a very mysterious way, charity. It is the love, as the poet says, that makes the stars run their course. It is love that has given life and existence to all things. And so if God speaks of his wrath, his blazing anger, if he says that I will not let the flames consume you, he doesn't have wrath and also charity. Wrath is the experience of God's burning furnace of charity by one who has chosen not to love him in return. The charity of God itself is experienced as wrath, as unbearable burning for the one who does not return that love to God. The souls of the damned are punished, as it were, by the very existence of God that they have chosen not to participate in. And similarly, the souls of the just experience the charity of God as this burning furnace of glory. God is the same God. It's us who are different. Our own condition is what determines our reception of God's existence. We will have God, but it will be either for glory and rest and peace and joy and delight for all eternity, or it will be for punishment because we have separated ourselves from him. We have chosen anything but God. And God says, "I will not give vent to my blazing anger. I will not let the flames consume you." A flame is that which consumes the fuel that is introduced into it. You put wood into a fireplace, you put coal into a furnace, you put fuel in, and the fuel is transformed and consumed. The consuming of the fuel transforms it into the very flame that consumes it. And this is the secret. God intends not to let the flames consume us unto destruction, because he intends to use the flame of his charity to transform us into his likeness. He wants us to receive the flame, to be like a candle wick that takes the fire and continues it, even when the original source might be separated from it physically, in order to continue bearing that flame into the world and in our hearts. We become transformed into the likeness of God. And this is how the flame will not consume us for destruction. We won't experience the blazing anger and wrath of God, but rather we will be transformed into his likeness. As the priest, Monsignor Charles Pope, a priest of Washington, D.C., says, a man I admire greatly, he says that we are to be brought up to the temperature of glory. We are cold here on this earth, but God's charity stirs us to flame. And so that when we are introduced into God's presence, we will not feel it as something foreign, alien, destructive of who we are, because we will have already been transformed. We will already have been brought up to that temperature of glory. We will experience God as our home, because he has already made us his home with us. St. Margaret Mary Alacoque was given instruction by Jesus to have this feast of the Sacred Heart proposed and promoted on the Friday, the day after the octave of Corpus Christi. For her, Corpus Christi was the feast that was only 400 years old. Corpus Christi was this great celebration of God's greatest gift to us, which is his very self in Holy Communion. And yet there are so many people who do not receive God in love. So many people who are indifferent to him, negligent of him, who offend him even by their contempt for his love. How many sacrilegious communions are committed? And these by those who should know better, the baptized who have received the gospel and God's grace into their hearts. And outside the home, the household of the faithful, how much contempt and negligence and ignorance is there, which is offensive to God, who is our Creator and our Redeemer. This feast of the Sacred Heart was meant to be a work of reparation for the sins of men, in order to make up for our offenses of God. And how? By returning to God the very love that he has planted in our hearts. That's the only way. What can we make of a sacrifice to God? What can we render to God that is worthy of him? Nothing but himself. We give him the very same sacrifice that he placed in our hands. The one sacrifice that is pleasing to God is God's Son, obeying him unto death. We render this same sacrifice to him day after day on our altars. We receive the fruits of that sacrifice in Holy Communion, which itself, if we are worthy, by God's grace, to receive Holy Communion, that very reception is itself an act of love, a making of myself a tabernacle and another element of this flame in the world. And God is pleased with that sacrifice. He is willing to overlook, as it were, the sins of other men and even our own sins because of this perfect act of charity that Christ has placed in our hands and has planted in our hearts. Indeed, and especially, the Feast of the Sacred Heart is an opportunity to offer reparation for the sins of priests who, because of their office and their special consecration and conformation to Christ by the sacrament of orders, offer great scandal to the world and even greater offense to God by their sins. My friends, pray especially for priests, that we may be saints, that we may lead God's people in the sanctification that he wants for all men. And how will you do this? As I say, especially by the reception worthily of Holy Communion, and therefore also frequently making confession, so that your soul can be a fit dwelling place for the Holy Spirit, a fit furnace for God's charity. But also you will do so by offering sacrifice. You become conformed to Christ. You and I and all Christians become conformed to Christ in the midst of suffering especially. It is by suffering that Christ offered his pure and perfect sacrifice to God the Father. And so we are not afraid of suffering. Christ sent his priests out into the world in order to suffer, in order to sanctify the rest of men. And this is why so many of the saints are depicted with the items, the icons of their suffering. When you see an image of St. Stephen, he's holding stones. St. Paul boasts of his sufferings in his writings. St. Peter is symbolized by the cross planted upside down on which he was crucified. His brother Andrew with an X-shaped cross. St. Francis of Assisi with the marks of the stigmata. St. Rita with the thorn that she received from the crucifix. St. John Vianney wasted away with his fasts. It is by suffering that we are conformed to Christ and therefore are worthy to offer sacrifice to God. Our sufferings are indeed, for us here on earth, the material that we have to offer him, with which he is pleased and for which he offers a great reward of graces that we will not understand on this earth. Think of what graces you have received, and now think perhaps for a moment, who was it who endured some suffering, who offered a sacrifice so that you would receive that grace? We won't know until we see it all revealed to us in heaven. And you now are the instruments of that grace in the world by your offering of sacrifice, by your willing endurance of suffering. Do not be afraid of suffering, because it is the perfect offering that we have to offer to God. We deserve it for our sins, and yet by grace it is transformed into the material of a pure sacrifice. And when we arrive in that happy home to which we are headed, our sufferings will be the trophies of our glory. Christ now still bears the marks of his passion, no longer in pain, but in triumph. And he invites you to join him in that sacrifice for your sake, for the sake of your brother Christians, for the sake of those who do not yet know Christ or even revile him. God wills all of our salvation. So be courageous in your offering, be joyful in your endurance, and be confident of the reward that is in store for all those who are faithful. Praise be Jesus Christ, now and forever.